It is the winter of 1841, and a 31-year-old lawyer in rural Illinois is systematically removing every knife, razor, and pair of scissors from his bedroom. He is terrified that if left alone with a sharp edge, he will use it to end his life. He is drowning in business debt. His political career has collapsed before it truly began, and the woman he intended to marry has broken off their engagement. He lies in a darkened room for weeks, catatonic, muttering that he is the most miserable man living. To the locals, he is just a socially awkward, uneducated failure, with a face so gaunt and asymmetrical it makes people uncomfortable. Yet, walk into the center of the American capital today, and you will find that same depressive failure enshrined in 170 tons of white Georgia marble. He is the secular saint of the Western world, the titan who held a disintegrating continent together with his bare hands, and whose words are etched into the very bedrock of democracy. How did a suicidal backwoods lawyer with less than 1 year of formal education rise from the dirt to become the savior of a dying nation? This is the story of Abraham Lincoln. To understand the man, you must first strip away the gold plating of history and look at the mud from which he was made. We like to romanticize the American frontier log cabin. We imagine a cozy, rustic simplicity, a fire crackling in the hearth, and a young boy learning to read by candlelight. But the reality of Abraham Lincoln's childhood was not romantic. It was a brutal, feral fight for survival against a landscape that actively tried to kill you. He was born into a world of crushing, suffocating silence. The Kentucky and Indiana wilderness of the early 1800s was a place of isolation so profound it could drive a person mad. The Lincoln family didn't live in a house. They lived in a half-faced camp. It wasn't even a cabin. It was a 3-sided lean-to made of rough logs and mud, with the 4th side completely open to the elements. In the winter, the wind didn't just knock at the door, it lived inside with them. They slept on piles of dried leaves and animal skins on the dirt floor, huddled together like livestock to keep from freezing to death. In this frozen abyss, young Abraham was not a child. He was an asset, a tool. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a hard, illiterate man built of muscle and resentment. To Thomas, a man's worth was measured solely by the trees he could fell and the furrows he could plow. He looked at his son, this gangly, swiftly growing giant who seemed to be all knees and elbows, and he didn't see a future president. He saw a farmhand. He saw labor. The tension between them was the defining conflict of Abraham's early life. Thomas despised Abraham's curiosity. When the boy was caught reading, often snatching moments while resting the horses at the end of a row, Thomas would strike him. He would knock him to the ground for the sin of laziness. In the eyes of his father, reading was a way to avoid real work. It was a character flaw. Thomas would even rent out his son to neighbors, taking every single penny the boy earned, enforcing the brutal law of the frontier. You are property until you are 21. Abraham was a slave to his father's ignorance long before he became the emancipator of a nation. But the physical labor was nothing compared to the emotional desolation. When Abraham was 9 years old, the darkness of the frontier took its first major piece of his soul. It came in the form of the milk sickness. In the unregulated wild, cows would eat white snake root, a toxic plant, and the poison would pass into their milk. It didn't just kill you, it tortured you. Abraham watched his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, drink that milk. He watched as her tongue turned black and swelled until she could no longer speak. He watched her body seize in violent tremors, her breath smelling thick and sweet with the scent of acetone as she vomited continuously for days. There was no doctor. There was no medicine. There was just a 9-year-old boy in a drafty, dirt floor cabin, holding his mother's hand as she withered into a corpse. When she finally died, the grief was compounded by the gruesome practicality of frontier life. There were no undertakers. Abraham, barely tall enough to hold a saw, had to help his father whittle the wooden pegs to build his own mother's coffin. He helped dig the grave in the hard, unforgiving earth. And then, he stood there as they lowered her down, effectively burying the only source of softness in his world. For months after, the cabin was a tomb. His father retreated into a sullen silence, leaving Abraham and his sister Sarah in a state of feral neglect. They were unwashed, dressed in rags, surviving on barely cooked game, living like wild animals. The depression that would haunt Lincoln for the rest of his life, the melancholy that historians later analyzed, planted its deep, black roots right here. He learned early that the people you love can be ripped away without warning, and that the universe is indifferent to your pain. Yet, in this starving, freezing darkness, a strange hunger began to grow in him. It wasn't a hunger for food, though he was often hungry. It was a hunger for words. The few schools that existed were blab schools, where students shouted lessons aloud, but Lincoln's attendance was sporadic at best, totaling less than 12 months over his entire life. But that didn't matter. He became a scavenger of information. He would walk 20 miles simply to borrow a book. He would read Robinson Crusoe, Aesop's Fables, and the King James Bible until he had memorized the cadence of the sentences. He didn't have paper. Paper was a luxury for the wealthy. So he would lie on his stomach in front of the fire, using a piece of charcoal to write words on the back of a wooden shovel. When the shovel was covered in writing, he would take a knife, shave off the top layer of wood, and start again. He literally carved his education out of the tools of his labor. This was the first act of rebellion. Every word he learned was a defiance of his father. Every sentence he memorized was a mental escape hatch from the dirt floor and the smell of manure. He was a giant, growing in a cage too small to hold him, surrounded by men who mocked his intellect, and a landscape that wanted him dead. He was a zero, in every sense of the word, poor, motherless, dominated by a tyrannical father, and trapped in the backwoods of Indiana. But the river was calling. And soon, he would see things that would shatter his world completely. The escape began on the water. In 1828, at the age of 19, Abraham Lincoln was hired to take a flatboat of produce down the Mississippi River to New Orleans. For a boy who had never seen a town bigger than a collection of shacks, this was like traveling to another planet. He stood on the deck of that raft, steering through the brown, churning currents of the Mississippi, navigating past river pirates and shifting sandbars. He was 6'4" now, a physical anomaly with arms that dangled past his knees and strength that was already becoming local folklore. He could lift a whiskey barrel and drink from the bung. He could chop more wood in a day than 3 men combined. But his body was just the vessel. On this river, his mind was waking up. When the raft drifted into the port of New Orleans, the sensory shock was violent. The air was thick with the smell of exotic spices, rotting fish, French perfume, and the sweat of thousands of strangers. It was a cacophony of languages: French, Spanish, English, Creole. But amidst this vibrant chaos, Lincoln walked into the city's darkest shadow, and it burned an image into his retina that would never fade. He saw the slave markets. He watched human beings, men, women, and children being paraded in chains like cattle. He saw girls examined by buyers, their teeth checked, their muscles prodded. He saw families ripped apart, hearing the screams of mothers as their children were sold down the river, never to be seen again. Up until this moment, slavery was an abstract concept to him, or a distant reality. Now, it was visceral. It smelled of fear. It looked like hell. According to legend, Lincoln watched the brutality, his jaw tight, his eyes burning, and muttered to his companion, "If I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I'll hit it hard." Whether he said the words exactly that way is history's guess, but the sentiment was the seed of the man he would become. He returned to the backwoods, carrying a heavy, cold anger. He had seen the ultimate tyranny, and it rhymed with the tyranny of his own father. The idea that one man has the right to eat the bread that another man's hand has earned. He finally broke free from his father's grip at 21, moving to a dusty, struggling village called New Salem, Illinois. New Salem was a place of rough men and muddy streets, a town of fierce wrestling matches and hard liquor. Lincoln arrived with nothing, literally nothing. He didn't even own a horse. He walked into town looking like a scarecrow, his trousers too short, exposing inches of his shins. He tried to start a business, a general store, partnering with a man named William Barry. But while Lincoln was honest, he was a terrible businessman. He would close the shop early to read or tell stories. His partner, Barry, drank up the profits. The business imploded, leaving Lincoln with a crushing burden of debt over $1,000 that he jokingly referred to as his national debt. It would take him years to pay it off. He was a failure as a shopkeeper. He was a failure as a soldier, briefly serving in the Black Hawk War, where, by his own admission, the only blood he saw was from mosquito bites. He was drifting, a piece of driftwood in a muddy stream. Then, fate intervened in the form of a barrel. One day, a destitute traveler passing through town offered to sell Lincoln an old barrel of junk for 50 cents. Lincoln, mostly out of charity, bought it. Later, dumping the contents onto the floor of the store, he found a beat-up hardcover book at the bottom. It was Blackstone's commentaries on the laws of England. This was the spark. For the next few months, the people of New Salem saw a strange sight. The giant rail splitter would be lying under an oak tree, barefoot, his long legs climbing up the trunk, completely absorbed in this dense, archaic legal text. He read until the sun went down, and then he read by the light of the cooper's shavings burning in the fire. Blackstone taught him that the world wasn't just chaos and mud. It had structure. It had rules. It had logic. Law was a mechanism where the weak could theoretically stand against the strong. He wasn't just reading, he was arming himself. But just as his mind found its purpose, his heart was ripped out. He had fallen in love with a young woman named Anne Rutledge. She was everything he wasn't. Beautiful, educated, the daughter of the tavern keeper. By all accounts, she was the first person to look past the ugly, awkward exterior of Abraham Lincoln and see the soul underneath. They were engaged to be married. For the first time in his life, Lincoln allowed himself to imagine happiness. Then came the summer of 1835. The heat brought the bilious fever, likely typhoid. Anne fell ill. Lincoln sat by her bedside, watching history repeat itself. Just as he had watched his mother die, he watched Anne fade. When she died on August 25th, Lincoln didn't just grieve, he shattered. The hypochondriasis returned with terrifying force. He was seen wandering the woods along the Sangamon River, muttering to himself, staring blankly at the water. He told friends that he could not bear the thought of the rain falling on her grave. His friends were so worried he would kill himself that they removed knives from his Reach-a pattern that would repeat. But in the crucible of that depression, something hardened. The grief stripped away the frivolity. He realized that happiness was a fragile, fleeting thing that could be stolen by a fever or a microbe. He couldn't rely on joy. He couldn't rely on love. He had to rely on something that couldn't die. He threw himself into the law with the desperation of a drowning man clutching a lifeline. He ran for the state legislature again, and this time, he won. Not because he was polished, but because he was real. He spoke the language of the farmers. He told jokes that disarmed his enemies. He used his storytelling, that gift, honed around the fireplaces of his youth, to mesmerizing effect. He packed his few belongings into saddlebags, he borrowed a horse, and he rode out of New Salem toward Springfield, leaving the physical labor of the frontier behind forever. He was no longer a rail splitter. He was a lawyer. The boy who had dug his mother's grave was now a man who would use words to dig the grave of the institution he hated. Springfield, Illinois, 1837. Lincoln is now a lawyer, but erase any image you have of mahogany desks and high-backed leather chairs. The reality of his life for the next 2 decades was the 8th Judicial Circuit, a muddy, exhaustion-filled loop of 14 counties that covered nearly 10,000 square miles. For 6 months a year, Lincoln lived in the saddle. He rode through rainstorms that turned the prairie roads into glue. He slept in roadside taverns that were little more than glorified shacks, often sharing a bed with the very opposing counsel he would argue against the next morning. It was a life of zero privacy. He ate bad food, fought off lice, and wore the same ill-fitting suit until it shone with grease. Yet, this grueling circuit was his laboratory. While other lawyers complained, Lincoln thrived. In the evenings, gathered around the tavern fire, the melancholy man would transform. He became the center of gravity. He told stories, earthy, sometimes bawdy, always hilarious yarns that had judges and juries gasping for air. He learned how to read a room, how to simplify complex legal theory into a parable that a farmer could understand. He was building the common touch that would one day disarm an entire nation. But when the laughter died and the fire burned down, the darkness was always waiting in the corner of the room. His depression was no longer a secret. It was a defining characteristic. His law partner, William Herndon, watched him closely. Herndon described Lincoln falling into a cave of gloom. He would sit for hours in their chaotic office, staring at the wall, eyes unfocused, dripping with a sorrow that seemed to have no bottom. He would recite the poem Mortality by William Knox. Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud? He was a man constantly at war with his own chemistry. He didn't take pills, he took work. He used geometry Euclid's axioms to discipline his mind, forcing his brain to focus on logic to keep the emotional chaos at bay. Politically, he seemed finished. He had served one solitary, unpopular term in the U.S. Congress, opposed the Mexican-American War, and was practically chased back to Illinois. By 1854, he was 45 years old. In his own mind, he was a washed-up politician, destined to be a small-town lawyer until he died. But then, the ground shook. His old rival, Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant, pushed the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress. This legislation effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, allowing slavery to expand into the northern territories. The tiger was loose. The compromise that had kept the Union from tearing itself apart was gone. Lincoln didn't just disagree. He was galvanized. The man who had been sleeping, the lawyer who had resigned himself to mediocrity, suddenly woke up. He saw the moral arc of the universe bending toward tyranny, and he could not stay silent. He began to stalk Douglas across the state. Where Douglas spoke, Lincoln followed, and the contrast could not have been more violent. Douglas was short, wealthy, powerful, and traveled in a private train car equipped with a cannon that fired to announce his arrival. Lincoln traveled in a regular passenger car, his knees jammed against the seat in front of him, carrying his papers in his stovepipe hat. It was David versus Goliath, if David was an awkward giant and Goliath was a polished celebrity. In 1858, Lincoln accepted the nomination to run for the Senate against Douglas. On a hot June evening in Springfield, He walked to the podium to give his acceptance speech. His advisors had begged him not to give it. They told him it was political suicide. They told him it was too radical. He walked up to the stage, unfolded his notes, and dropped the hammer. A house divided against itself cannot stand. He didn't promise peace, he promised conflict. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other. The words sent a shockwave through the North. He was forcing the country to look in the mirror. He was stripping away the polite euphemisms of politics and exposing the rotting infection at the core of the republic. The ensuing Lincoln-Douglas debates were a brutal, bare-knuckle brawl of ideas. They spoke for hours in the baking sun. Douglas race-baited, calling Lincoln a black Republican and playing to the fears of white voters. Lincoln parried with cold logic and moral fury, dismantling Douglas's arguments with the precision of a surgeon. But when the votes were counted, Lincoln lost. The state legislature, still dominated by Democrats, re-elected Douglas. Lincoln was defeated again. He wrote to a friend that he felt like the boy that stumped his toe. It hurt too bad to laugh, and he was too big to cry. He was nearly 50 years old. He had lost 2 Senate races. He had no money. To the casual observer, Act 3 of his life had ended in failure. But he had missed the point. He had lost the election, but he had won the argument. The transcripts of those debates were being printed in newspapers across the country. People in New York and Boston were asking, "Who is this prairie lawyer? Who is this man who speaks with the tongue of a prophet?" He had lost the battle for Illinois, but he had inadvertently positioned himself for the war for America. The stage was set, the fuse was lit, and the country was about to explode. Abraham Lincoln did not arrive in Washington, D.C. like a hero. He arrived like a fugitive. In February 1861, facing credible intelligence of an assassination plot in Baltimore, the president-elect was forced to sneak into his own capital in the dead of night. He arrived at 6 a.m., disguised in a soft wool cap and a shawl, slipping through the shadows of the train station. The press tore him apart. They published cartoons of him shaking in fear, wearing a dress. Before he had spent a single night in the White House, half the country hated him, and the other half thought he was a coward. Then, the guns fired on Fort Sumter, and the floor dropped out of the world. The Civil War was not the short, romantic skirmish everyone predicted. It was an industrial slaughterhouse. And Lincoln, the man who had once been too tender-hearted to kill a turtle, was now the commander-in-chief of the bloodiest conflict in Western history. He didn't live in the White House. He haunted it. He barely slept. He barely ate. He spent his nights at the War Department telegraph office, staring at the wall, waiting for the click-clack-click of the machine to tell him how many thousand boys had died that day. He read every telegram. He didn't just count the casualties. He felt them. Observers said that with every defeat, Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, his face seemed to cave in a little more, the lines etching deeper into his skin like geological fissures. But the war wasn't finished taking from him. It wanted his heart, too. In February 1862, while the Union Army was floundering, his beloved 11-year-old son, Willie, the intelligent, kind-hearted favorite who looked just like him, fell ill with typhoid fever. The irony was cruel. Downstairs in the East Room, a lavish state dinner was taking place. The Marine Band was playing lively polkas. Champagne was flowing. Upstairs, Willie was gasping for air. Lincoln spent the night moving between the two worlds, the forced smile of the politician downstairs, and the terrified father holding a dying child upstairs. When Willie died, Lincoln collapsed. He would shut himself in his room for days. He reportedly visited the crypt in Georgetown to open the coffin and hold his son's cold body. His wife Mary went mad with grief, screaming in the hallways. The house was divided, the nation was dying, and the president was a ghost walking through a mausoleum. Yet, in this furnace of agony, the steel was finally tempered. Lincoln realized that the war could not be won with maps and muskets alone. It had to be won with a moral crusade. The Zero, who had seen the slaves in chains in New Orleans 30 years prior, decided it was time to strike. He wrote the Emancipation Proclamation in secret, but he couldn't release it. If he released it while the Union was losing, it would look like the desperate scream of a dying government. He needed a victory. He needed blood to buy freedom. He waited for months. Finally, on September 17, 1862, the armies crashed into each other at Antietam. It was the single bloodiest day in American history. 23,000 casualties in 12 hours. The creek ran red. It was a tactical draw, but the Confederate Army retreated. That was enough. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln sat down at his desk to sign the document that would free 3 million human beings. He dipped his pen in the ink, but he hesitated. His hand was trembling violently. It wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. He had shook thousands of hands that morning at a New Year's reception, and his arm was numb. But he looked at the paper, and he looked at the witnesses, and he said, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." He gripped the pen so hard his knuckles turned white, and he signed. The war dragged on for 2 more hellish years. The Backwoods lawyer had transformed. He was no longer the awkward stump speaker. He was a wartime mystic. He spoke of God's will and national punishment. When he delivered the Gettysburg Address, a 2-minute speech that followed a 2-hour oration by a famous scholar, he redefined the meaning of the war. He took the carnage and turned it into a sacrament. By 1865, he looked like a man of 80. A life mask taken of his face during the war compared to one taken before shows a terrifying degradation. His eyes are hollow caves. His cheeks are sunken. He had absorbed the pain of the entire nation into his own body. In April 1865, the end finally came. Richmond fell. Lincoln did something no conquering emperor had ever done. He walked into the captured Confederate capital, not with a tank or a regiment, but with a handful of sailors. He walked the streets of the city that had wanted him dead. The liberated slaves recognized him. They surged around him, weeping, trying to touch his coat. An old man fell to his knees to worship him. Lincoln looked down, his face filled with an infinite, weary sadness, and said, "Don't kneel to me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only, and thank Him for the liberty you will hereafter enjoy." He had done it. The boy from the dirt floor cabin had saved the Union. The rail splitter had broken the chains. He returned to Washington a victor. But the script of his life demanded one final tragic twist. The cost of saving the world is that you don't get to live in it. On April 14th, 1865, mere days after the Confederate surrender, Abraham Lincoln did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He relaxed. It was Good Friday. The air in Washington was electric with the scent of blooming lilacs and victory. In the afternoon, Lincoln took his wife Mary for a carriage ride. He was cheerful, almost giddy. He held her hand and spoke about the future, a future without gun smoke. He told her, "Mary, we have had a hard time of it since we came to Washington, but the storm is over, and with God's help, we shall now be happy." It was the last clear promise he would ever make. That evening, they went to Ford's Theater to see a comedy, Our American Cousin. Lincoln sat in the rocking chair in the presidential box, draped in flags. He looked tired, but peaceful. At roughly 10:15 p.m., the play reached one of its funniest lines. The audience roared with laughter. And in that swelling wave of noise, a single, sharp crack echoed. Most people thought it was part of the show. It wasn't until a man leaped from the box to the stage, shattering his leg on impact and shouting, "Sic semper tyrannis," that the reality set in. The bullet, fired by John Wilkes Booth, had entered behind Lincoln's left ear. The giant slumped forward. The man who had dodged death in the frozen woods of Indiana, who had survived the suicidal darkness of his own mind, and who had outlasted the Confederate Army, had been taken by a deranged actor with a pocket pistol. They couldn't move him back to the White House. The cobblestones would have jarred him to death instantly. So, soldiers carried the unconscious president across the street to a cramped boarding house owned by a tailor named Peterson. They laid him diagonally across a bed that was too short for his long frame. All night long, the government of the United States gathered in that small, blood-stained room. They stood vigil as the president's breathing grew ragged, a terrible, labored sound that filled the house. Outside, a crowd of thousands stood in the rain, silent, waiting. At 7:22 the next morning, the breathing stopped. The rain stopped. The struggle was over. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, the man who had once called Lincoln a long-armed ape, but had come to love him as a father, stood by the bedside. With tears streaming down his face, he broke the silence with 6 words that became the epitaph of an era. Now he belongs to the ages. But what does that mean? What does it mean to belong to the ages? It means that Abraham Lincoln is no longer just a man. He is a map. He is the cartography of the American soul. Look back at the 0. Look at the boy shivering in a 3-sided shed in the wilderness, watching his mother die of milk sickness. Look at the young man hiding all the knives in his room because he was terrified of his own brain. Look at the failed shopkeeper, the defeated politician, the awkward, ugly, rejected lawyer who was told by the world that he was nothing. Now, look at the hero, the man who signed the paper that broke the chains of 4 million people, the man who redefined the purpose of democracy in 272 words at Gettysburg, the man who saved the Union. The distance between those 2 points is infinite. It shouldn't be possible. But Lincoln proved that it is. His life is the ultimate testament to the idea that you are not defined by your origins. You are not defined by your trauma. You are not defined by the chemical imbalance in your brain or the dirt on your boots. Lincoln didn't succeed despite his suffering. He succeeded because of it. His depression hollowed him out. Yes, but it carved a space deep enough to hold the sorrow of an entire nation. His poverty gave him a hatred of tyranny that no aristocrat could ever understand. He was the 0 who became the greatest hero because he never forgot what it felt like to be small. Today, if you walk into the Lincoln Memorial, you don't see a conquering warrior on a horse with a sword raised high. You see a tired man sitting in a chair. His hands are resting on his knees. He looks weary. He looks sad. But he also looks strong. He looks like a man who carried the weight of the world and didn't break until the work was done. The backwoods lawyer is gone. But the Union he saved stands, and the lesson of his life that even the most broken among us can heal the world will never die.